There is a photograph taken backstage at Madison Square Garden in 1988. Mike Tyson is seated alone in a folding chair, draped in a white towel, staring at the concrete floor beneath his feet. The world outside that locker room believed he was untouchable. The papers called him the baddest man on the planet. Children wore his name on their backs like armor. Governments requested audiences with him. Promoters built entire careers simply by standing close enough to his shadow. But in that photograph, if you look past the muscle and the championship belts hung carelessly on a hook behind him, you see something no camera was supposed to capture. His hands are trembling, not from adrenaline, from fear. And the most devastating detail, he was 19 years old, and he had not slept alone in 3 years because the dark still terrified him. There is an irony in Mike Tyson's story that hurts too much to be coincidence. The child who could not speak without being laughed at, whose lisp turned every classroom into a small, suffocating theater of cruelty, whose voice was the very first weapon used against him. The teenager who discovered that his fists could silence a world his words never could. That inside a ring he became something the streets had never once offered him. Visible, powerful, impossible to ignore. The icon who built an entire empire on controlled violence, on the mythology of absolute dominance, on the terrifying beauty of a man who had made fear his native tongue. All of that, so that life would arrive decades later and begin dismantling exactly that. The power, the invincibility, the armor. All of it. Piece by quiet piece. How does a child shaped entirely by poverty and street violence become the most feared athlete on the planet? What lived behind the mask of the man the world called a monster? And what happens when the only identity you have ever worn, the only thing that ever made you feel safe, begins fracturing under the weight of everything you spent a lifetime refusing to feel? To understand all of that, we need to go back to the beginning, to Brownsville, Brooklyn, to 1966, and to a boy who learned, in the cruelest way imaginable, that the world respects power and punishes softness without mercy. Michael Gerard Tyson was born on June 30th, 1966, in Cumberland Hospital, Brooklyn, New York. Brownsville was not a neighborhood that produced comfort or second chances. It was a landscape of cracked sidewalks and exhausted buildings, of streets that smelled like rust and resignation, of a sky that always seemed 2 shades too heavy. His mother, Lorna Mae Tyson, worked whatever job she could find to keep the family from dissolving completely. His father, Purcell Tyson, was a presence so absent he barely left a shadow. He disappeared from the family before Mike could form a memory of him, leaving Lorna alone with 3 children in a borough that did not forgive weakness. There was no luxury, no connections, no paved road toward anything resembling hope. But there was something more dangerous than poverty living inside those walls. There was a boy who felt everything at twice the intensity the world intended. Mike was small for his age. He spoke with a pronounced lisp, a soft and uncertain voice that became a target the moment it entered any schoolyard in Brownsville. He was not Mike to them. He was the fairy boy. The pigeon kid, because he kept birds on the rooftop, a quiet and private tenderness that his peers translated without hesitation into weakness. The cruelty was not occasional. It was the architecture of his daily existence, constructed fresh, every single morning. One afternoon, an older boy grabbed one of his pigeons from the rooftop ledge and snapped its neck in front of him, slowly, watching his face the entire time. That moment, that specific image of helplessness, that inability to protect the only soft thing he had ever allowed himself to love, carved something permanent and unreachable into him. He learned very early that silence was safer than crying, and that tears in Brownsville were simply an invitation for more. Years later, sitting across from a journalist with a stillness that cost him something visible, he would confess, "I used to get robbed every day. Every single day. And I would cry. I was a crybaby, but I learned that if you show them something scarier than what they fear, they leave you alone." By 13, he had been arrested 38 times, not from ambition or thrill, from the cold arithmetic of surviving a world that had already decided his value. At 13, the state made the decision for him. A judge sent him to the Tryon School for Boys in Johnstown, a juvenile detention facility that felt less like rehabilitation and more like a warehouse for children the city had quietly given up on. His first dream, fragile and wordless as it was, of simply belonging somewhere safe, was erased before it had fully taken shape. For most boys inside that system, Tryon was the final chapter. But then a 70-year-old boxing trainer named Cus D'Amato watched Mike hit a heavy bag for the first time and said something no human being had ever directed at him before. He said, with absolute calm, that boy can be heavyweight champion of the world. With those words, something shifted inside Mike Tyson. Not healed, not repaired. Shifted, because Cus D'Amato saw the lisp and the arrests and the trembling and looked past all of it to something Mike himself could not yet name. He brought Mike into his home in Catskill, New York, became his legal guardian after Lorna's health collapsed, and for the first time in his life, Mike Tyson slept in a house where someone checked whether he was still breathing. Inside the gym, fists meeting leather, the lisp vanished. The crybaby disappeared. There was only impact, only force, only the one language in which Mike Tyson had ever been completely, devastatingly fluent. At 18, with a gym bag, a handful of amateur trophies, and a rage he had not yet learned to aim precisely, Mike Tyson turned professional. He arrived at his first fight in Albany, New York, in March 1985, not with the swagger the world would later associate with him, but with something raw and more dangerous than confidence. He arrived with desperation, wearing the costume of focus. No safety net existed beneath him. Cus D'Amato had mortgaged everything on this boy from Brownsville, and Mike knew it with every step he took toward that ring. New York in the mid-'80s was not kind to fragile beginnings. It was a city that had already seen 10,000 young men arrive with hunger and leave with nothing but the memory of their own foolishness. But Mike did not arrive hungry for fame. He arrived hungry for the specific silence that only came when his fists connected and the crowd forgot to breathe. He won his first professional fight in the first round. Then, the next. Then, the next. The wins accumulated not like a career being built, but like a debt being collected. One body at a time, from a world that owed him something he could not yet name. He washed dishes between early fights. He sat in borrowed cars counting the money from small purses, calculating whether it covered the week. He shared cramped rooms with other fighters, equally stubborn and equally invisible to a world that had not yet decided to look. But inside every arena, regardless of size, something happened the moment the bell rang. The boy who had been robbed every day in Brownsville became something else entirely, something that did not ask permission and did not accept limits. The stutter of his childhood, the smallness, the grief, all of it compressed into something the sport had never quite seen before. Then, on November 22, 1986, 20 days before his 21st birthday, Mike Tyson knocked out Trevor Berbick in the second round and became the youngest heavyweight champion in boxing history. The moment was not graceful. It was seismic. Berbick fell in a way that seemed to defy the geometry of a human body, and Mike stood over him, not with celebration, but with something closer to exhaustion, as if he had finally, after 20 years, put down something unbearably heavy. The numbers that followed were staggering. By 1988, he was undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, unifying the WBA, WBC, and IF titles. His fights generated over $200 million in revenue. He appeared on the covers of every magazine that mattered. Don King draped him in spectacle and sold him to the world as a force of nature rather than a human being. And the world, hungry for myth, accepted the transaction without question. But behind the sold-out arenas and the private jets, something was beginning to fracture that no cornerman could fix between rounds. Cus D'Amato, the only father Mike had ever trusted, the only voice that had ever made the darkness feel temporary, died in November 1985, just as Mike's ascent was beginning. He left before he could witness what he had built, and Mike was left to climb the rest of the mountain alone, without the one person who had ever looked at him and seen something worth saving. The personal destruction arrived in layers, the way it always does when a person builds their entire identity on something external. In 1988, Mike married actress Robin Givens. The relationship was immediate, intense, and conducted entirely in public view. Within a year, it had collapsed into one of the most brutal and publicized divorces the entertainment world had witnessed. Robin appeared on national television beside Mike and described living with him as pure torture. He sat next to her in silence. The image traveled everywhere. For the world, it was spectacle. For Mike, it was humiliation compounded by grief, compounded by a loneliness so complete it had become its own physical weight. The convictions followed. In 1992, Mike Tyson was convicted of rape and sentenced to 6 years in prison, serving 3. The fall from the summit was not gradual. It was vertical. The man who had been called invincible sat in an Indiana correctional facility while the world revised its mythology of him from fearsome champion to cautionary tale. He emerged in 1995 changed in ways that did not show immediately but revealed themselves slowly in erratic decisions and escalating chaos. The fights continued, some brilliant, some hollow. In 1997, he bit off a piece of Evander Holyfield's ear during their rematch and was disqualified and banned. An image so strange and so perfectly symbolic of a man consuming himself from the outside in that it became the defining photograph of his decline. By the early 2000s, Mike Tyson had earned an estimated $300 million across his career. He had also spent every dollar of it, declaring bankruptcy in 2003 while owing debts exceeding $23 million. The houses, the tigers, the entourage, the excess, all of it was not indulgence so much as a desperate attempt to fill a space that money had never been designed to fill. Mike Tyson remained standing. Not upright in the way of champions, standing in the harder, quieter way of someone who has lost everything and discovered, to their own bewilderment, that they are still present. He found sobriety. He found a third wife, Lakia Spicer, and a family that grounded him in something real. He stepped onto a stage in a one-man show called Undisputed Truth and told his own story without armor, without mythology, to audiences who wept because they recognized something of themselves in his wreckage. Today, Mike Tyson carries the evidence of his journey in his body and in his eyes equally. The tattoo on his face, chosen at the height of his chaos, has become something different with age, not a symbol of menace, a symbol of a man who stopped pretending. What lesson do you carry from Mike Tyson's story? How many times have you rebuilt yourself from rubble when the world had already written your ending? Share your reflection below and subscribe for more stories of those who transformed their deepest wounds into their most enduring strength. Because in the end, the baddest man on the planet was never the one who never fell. It was always the one who got up when absolutely no one, including himself, believed he still could.